Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Catching SSH and RDP Attacks Without Decryption, sponsored by Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speaker is John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight. If during the webcast you have any questions for John, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John.
Thanks, Carol. Just a quick sound check. How do I sound?
You sound great.
Great. Let's get started. Welcome to today's webcast, Catching SSH and RDP Attacks Without Decryption. As Carol mentioned, I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight. I've been with Corelight for the last 4 years, but I've spent my career representing data protection products in the broader cybersecurity space, most recently representing an endpoint security product in the mobile space, and for the last 4 years, as I mentioned, Corelight on the network security monitoring side. Quick agenda. I know everybody spends their days on Zoom these days, and I'm going to try to keep this shorter. So we've got an hour, but I've got about 24 slides, so I'm going to be aiming for closer to half an hour. First, we'll take a look at the SSH and RDP protocols and look at some of the attack vectors there and challenges with defending. Next, we'll look at a popular open source tool called Zeek, which is a great tool and technology to go after SSH and RDP attacks without needing to decrypt them, notably. Third, we'll look quickly at Corelight's commercial offering and how that fits into the picture here with this problem space and Zeke. And we'll close with a Q&A. If you have questions at any point, feel free to ask them. You can just type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar panel. I'm going to save questions for the end, but please type them in so we can see them. And if we don't have time to get to everyone's, although I think we will today, given I'm aiming for a shorter presentation, I can follow up with you afterwards via email. So with that, let's dive in. Network defenders need to adapt and have already adapted over the last year to remote work, because remote work changes a lot of the environmental considerations of defense. You know, and I saw this stat actually just earlier this week, so I thought it was a great stat to include. 51% of global knowledge workers will be remote by the end of this year. And that's a stat that comes from Gartner. Earlier this week, they put out a press release based on some research. If you're like myself, I'm currently working remotely right now. Many of you probably are or have been working remotely over the last 12 to 15 months. You know, this trend is going to continue to hold. Certainly, there's definitely a return to office, but we are seeing many organizations grant flexible work policies. And so there's going to be a lot of remote activity going forward, where you have employees in your organization or partners connecting into potentially sensitive infrastructure in your environment. And that changes the network defense challenge considerably. I mean, you know, people like to say the perimeter is dead, the perimeter is dead. Well, it's not dead, it's just there's a lot of different perimeters now that you need to defend, whether that's cloud perimeters, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this work from home trend, this remote work trend that we've seen in the pandemic that will continue to hold as per this Gartner research, changes that picture again, because you're going to be seeing a lot more remote connectivity, and that means things like increased VPN usage or increased protocol activity associated with remote protocol connections. You're going to see potentially a lot more BYOD, right? People using you know, personal devices, even when they shouldn't be, to connect into corporate resources, whether those are sensitive or not. And so, as we think about this challenge and what a world of you know, half of organizations, or half of an employee base rather, working remotely, what does that mean from a network defense perspective? Well, today's presentation, we're going to zero in on one particular lens of that problem, which is defending remote friendly protocols, and specifically defending SSH and RDP, Secure Shell Protocol and Remote Desktop Protocol. These are, you know, great friends of remote workers. It allows people in, you know, wherever they're sitting, if they're authorized, to connect into sensitive infrastructure, hosts, servers, systems, and do their job, and do it, you know, efficiently from a remote perspective. And, you know, I think, you know, you're going to see, you know, people on the DevOps team using these connections. You're going to see people, system admins, using these connections. You're going to see engineers using these protocols to connect into sensitive infrastructure. A great example of this actually is in my own life. My partner is a mechanical engineer, and she uses RDP to connect into internal development environments on that have high compute needs that her desktop computer just can't handle. So she RDPs in every day of working remotely into these sensitive environments where builds and designs are happening. And so those are just a sample of some of the workers who are currently and will be using these two protocols to do their jobs. Now let's take a look at SSH for a second. So just to baseline knowledge, I think most people on today's call are probably familiar. Some are certainly familiar at greater technical depth than myself, but let's just baseline knowledge here. So Secure Shell Protocol, right, SSH. It's a protocol that functionally enables network services operations over unsecured networks. So it creates a secure, encrypted, basically line of communication, and it defaults onto port 22. Use cases can include, remote sysadmin work for various systems and applications. You can use it to connect to a remote host and execute commands on that host. It's even used for file transfer, and its origin in the 90s was sort of an evolution from FTP, actually. So file transfer continues to remain a popular use case for SSH. But as great as it is from a remote enablement perspective for legitimate uses, it's also conversely a favored protocol for abuse by adversaries. And you can see there on the right just some examples of attack types that you've been dealing with here. Port scanning, right? That's simply reconnaissance, where someone's looking for open SSH ports in your environment. Brute forcing SSH connections, so basically breaking in and establishing authorized lines of communication that functionally look legitimate to you from a system administration perspective because they brute force into legitimate connections. And once they're inside, there's a whole range of different bad things people can use SSH servers and SSH connections to do, from launching DDoS attacks to moving laterally with an environment to these systems that are connected to those SSH servers. Once you're in, it's a really, really powerful way to basically continue the attack chain. Because there's just so many things you can do once you have an established SSH connection into an internal environment. From a MITRE ATT&CK perspective, I always like to bring these discussions of attack vectors and problem spaces back to MITRE ATT&CK. I just think it's such a phenomenal way to kind of think about the attack space, and I'm sure everyone on today's call is familiar with it at some degree. But here with SSH, right, it falls along a couple different verticals: persistence and lateral movement, notably. With specific techniques documented there on screen. So for example, right, persistence, SSH authorized keys. One technique that attackers will use is once they've broken in, is they'll actually kind of overwrite or add to the authorized key file in SSH their own key pairs or public keys, basically establishing a key backdoor so they can maintain persistence in that environment, even if something changes. So that's just one specific example of a very technical attack documented technique related to SSH that you need to keep in mind as you're thinking about how to defend these protocols. What's some examples of attacks in the wild? Well, here's a good example from last spring. This was an interesting piece of malware that was basically doing port scanning, looking for open SSH ports, and it was brute forcing its way into those SSH connections. Starting with the root admin, right? It was looking for open SSH ports and then basically coming in through a root administration kind of authorization. And then once inside, using that infrastructure to launch further attacks. And in this particular case, it seems that this particular malware was primarily used as a DDoS launching mechanism. So once they compromised these SSH connections and gotten inside environments, they were using that infrastructure to generate and direct DDoS attacks on other infrastructure, whether that was the compromised organization or other parties. And so this is just one example, right, of real world last 12 months documented in the wild SSH compromise. Let's turn and look at RDP for a second. So remote desktop protocol. Originally developed as a Microsoft proprietary protocol, but of course RDP today, supports various operating systems. So there's RDP for Mac as well. It's not just a Windows-based protocol, although primarily that's where a lot of the activity continues to be, of course. Fundamentally, it enables a graphical user interface to another computer. So in the case of my partner, as I mentioned earlier, as an engineer, she gets to basically use the design and build software on these high compute environments internally once she RDPs into them. And so she is seeing the desktop of these machines in the internal environment. It's encrypted like SSH, and it defaults to port 3389. Use cases, as I mentioned just now, accessing high compute applications. When you can RDP into more powerful machines, you can perform more CPU intensive workloads without basically burning your laptop up. It's also used for cross-platform application and functionality. So you might be on a Mac or you might be on a Windows, and you might want to RDP into one of the opposite environments and run applications or functionality that your operating system on your desktop that you're using doesn't support. Also an admin tool as well. Now, again, great, ability to provide and support remote workers, but also a favored protocol for abuse and attack. Brute forcing, of course, but it's also a great tool, unfortunately, for adversaries to basically move laterally and issue commands to execute inside the environment, such as ransomware spread, right? A lot of ransomware these days is going after Windows environments. And so RDP as a kind of native Windows protocol originally comes with every Microsoft machine, right? Is RDP enabled. And so, it's low-hanging fruit for attackers in a lot of cases to scan the web for open RDP that's vulnerable, brute force their way in, and dump malware in the environment. And we've seen a lot of that activity in the last 12 months, especially. Again, bringing this back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, because I always like to ground it in that framework in discussions. Examples of specific TTPs here, right? RDP hijacking, as I just mentioned, taking a legitimate RDP connection, hijacking it, and using it to, for example, spread ransomware internally. Attacks in the wild. Well, let's keep talking about ransomware for a minute. Remote work didn't cause this shift in terms of RDP abuse for ransomware. That was already a shift that was kind of well underway before this remote work shift in the last 12 to 14 months. And really, I think that shift came from the ransomware kind of focus, right? It historically, in years past, was often a consumer problem where consumers were being, attacked. Their laptops were being encrypted, and they were being threatened, by various false entities for, crypto payments. And then there was a shift, and the attackers realized, you know what, we can go after corporations here. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a shift over to corporations and ransomware focus. And RDP is the, unfortunately, ideal vector for delivering ransomware in this case, because it's such a widely used and supported protocol. And in many cases, because hardening mechanisms haven't been taken by these organizations, it's kind of wide open in some cases for attackers to come in. And so ransomware is just one example of the damage that you can do by compromising an RDP connection in your environment. Okay, so the topic, right, of today's conversation is, so what do you do about this when you can't decrypt these connections? Because SSH and RDP, again, are by default encrypted protocols. So what happens when you can't break and inspect these connections? For a variety of reasons, that may be true in your particular environment. Cost, privacy, regulatory, performance concerns, IT, objections, et cetera, you may find yourself in a situation as a security analyst, as a defender, where you're not going to be able to see the payload information of those connections. And yet you've got to get ahead of these problems that we just talked about earlier. So how do you do that if you can't break and inspect? Well, I'm going to talk about Zeek in just a minute. I mentioned it's a powerful open source tool that can help address this problem, but let's frame the discussion of Zeek in a broader context, right? Network detection and response, NDR. NDR is not a firewall, right? A firewall or an inline IPS system, signature driven, is not going to help you much, if at all, in the context of an RDP and SSH kind of defense, problem space. But NDR, the holistic monitoring of all of your network traffic, grabbing visibility at all points where possible, and then analyzing that, again, at a kind of comprehensive, holistic level to make inferences and insight and generate evidence about what's actually happening on the wire, that's NDR. And it's a natural complement to EDR. And of course, all of that information is often aggregated in a central data lake, such as a SIM. What you see here on screen is sometimes described as the SOC triad by Gartner. XDR diagrams often are basically depicting this kind of integrated workflow where you have a central pane of glass for your entire environment, whether that's endpoint or network. But the point here is that if you can't decrypt these connections back to SSH and RDP, you're going to need to be able to monitor them in your NDR approach at some level. How can you do that? Well, Zeek, open source Zeek, is, I think, the best tool for the job. This technology was purpose-built to make fast sense of network traffic for security purposes. And that's a really important distinction because there's a lot of different ways to make sense of your network out there, right? You can use logs that are kicked off by the various appliances in your environment, but those aren't necessarily security purpose-built. Those are often logs meant for IT use cases such as performance monitoring or troubleshooting the devices themselves, right? The routers, the servers in your environment. Security teams use them because they're available, but it doesn't mean that they were designed for security needs, and they often run into challenges where they're missing information needed in security context. Zeek, open source Zeek, doesn't suffer from that problem because it was designed with security in mind, and it does three things exceptionally well. It takes all the raw network traffic and all of its machine code grittiness and packets, and it transforms it into logs, protocol logs that are organized by connection. And we'll dive into that in a minute. But these logs are a gold standard for evidence of what happened on the wire if you're a security investigator and you need to understand this alert fired, but is it valid? And how did it happen? And what happened before? And who else is affected in my environment? These logs that Zeek generates are phenomenal for answering those type of questions. The second thing Zeek does exceptionally well is it extracts and reassembles files. Hundreds of different file types are supported. And so you can be extracting PDFs, PowerPoints, executable files from your raw network traffic using Zeek for downstream file analysis or forensics. And then lastly, Zeek is a Turing-complete programming language. Zeek is actually a programming language whose default configuration generates great logs and extracted files. But because it's a programming language, it's extensible, which means you, as a user of this, can actually take those capabilities and extend them to whatever your imagination, can think of, really. Your imagination is the limit. You say, oh, you know what? I think I'd like to go over here and look at this RDP connection over here and look for these three signals. And I'd like to create an alert when these three signals match these kind of parameters. You can do that with Zeek because there's a scripting language built around it. You can actually script the logic that I just mentioned. So in short, Zeek's really, really good at taking network traffic and helping security teams make sense of it, but it's also really good at doing that in an encrypted traffic context as well. It does not break and inspect, to be clear, but it does parse encrypted traffic protocols, and it parses them in great detail. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. So Zeek logs, let's just double click here for a second. What makes them special? Well, one of the things that makes them special is that they're connection oriented, which means you don't have to line up timestamps from two different logs that were never designed to be correlated together in your environment. These logs are pre-correlated, which means that there's a connection established and a DNS request is made and an HTTP session is initiated and a file download occurs as a result of that HTTP session. Those three things are all connected, and they're connected in Zeek logs via a UID, which makes it really easy as an analyst in your SIM to click that UID and pivot and see all the protocol activity. So Zeek allows you as an analyst to make really fast sense of connections, and that's important because that's how we think about attacks, right? Attacks are connections from a network perspective. They're not appliance-oriented logs, which is kind of, if you think about it, what a DNS server log is. It's a log describing and oriented around the function of that particular DNS appliance. It's not connection oriented insofar as it's not protocol aware outside of DNS. It's just simply interested in the appliance itself. But Zeek is different. Zeek is thinking about it in terms of connections and stitching those connections across port and protocol activity. Also, the depth of the information that Zeek logs generates in general is a lot deeper than what you're going to get out of other logs you might be using in your environment to make sense of network traffic. Just quickly here, a sample to prove what I just said. DNS log, right? A Zeek DNS log you see on the top there, and a typical DNS server log you see there on the bottom. Already you can see that there's more information there. Does that matter? Yes, it actually does in a security context in many cases. Many DNS appliance logging mechanisms are not by default or capable even of logging the full DNS query and response of the connection. That's just not a materially important piece of information from an IT perspective necessarily to troubleshoot. And so they don't collect it in many cases. But security teams need that information because DNS is a highly abused protocol that can be used from everything from C2 connectivity to data exfiltration. And that occurs via those queries and responses. That's the mechanism by which that data or those commands are transmitted. And so you as a security defender, you need the full content of the query and response, and Zeek gives it to you because, again, purpose-built for security. Okay, I've talked a lot about Zeek. Let's bring this back to RDP and SSH. Guess what? Zeek generates those rich encrypted traffic logs I mentioned. It does it for SSH and it does it for RDP. And you can see them here on screen, SSH on the left, RDP on the right, and the fields below. That means for every SSH connection and every RDP connection, you get a Zeek log in your SIM or data lake tool of choice, streaming your Zeek logs to that tool. Okay, well, we're not breaking and inspecting anything here, so a skeptic might wonder, is there any value to this data that I'm looking at right here? I mean, we're not breaking and inspecting the connection, so does this stuff matter? Is it just kind of metadata exhaust that's not very useful in a security context? Not at all. It can be highly useful. I'll give you two examples here from each side. So on the SSH side, if you look at that log, let's see here, you can look at auth attempts, the fifth field down, auth attempts, right? It gives you a count about the number of authentication attempts seen for that particular SSH connection. Well, that's a pretty interesting piece of contextual information if that number starts to creep up, because that either means somebody forgot their password or someone's trying to brute force their way into the account. And so directionally, it's a very interesting piece of information that when married with other pieces of perhaps non-encrypted traffic insight in your environment can start to form a pretty compelling and concerning picture in your investigation. All right, let's take a look at the RDP log. Let's see here. I know a great example. Keyboard layout. That would be the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh field down there on the RDP log, keyboard layout. Why does that matter? Well, there's a pretty interesting use case for that particular piece of information. My keyboard right now, if you were to look at my RDP log where I to RDP from my laptop into my sensitive corporate environment via RDP, would show an English language keyboard layout, right, in that field. But sometimes it's not an English language keyboard layout. And if you're in the Western Hemisphere in an English speaking environment, and suddenly you see a Cyrillic keyboard layout, well, that's odd. Maybe it's legitimate, but it's definitely a string worth tugging on. Sometimes out of Eastern Europe and Russia, various adversaries will forget that simple detail right there, and they'll just leave their keyboard as is, which is a default Cyrillic keyboard layout. And now you've identified that in your RDP log, and that kind of stands out like a sore thumb if the rest of your RDP connections are not Cyrillic, right? I mean, and you can filter on that kind of use case I just laid out. You could hop right into your SIM and you could say, show me all RDP connections in my environment that are not using an English language configuration. Cyrillic, Turkic, whatever it is, they could pull it up right there from a single query, and you could pull it up in a matter of seconds, which is a really powerful inventory mechanism and potential risk indicator in your environment. But it's not just the logs. There is a whole community-driven insight capability behind Zeek, right? I mentioned that third key capability of Zeek is its extensibility. Its Turing completeness means you can script and build on top of the framework. And that's exactly what the open source Zeek community has done. And they've done it specifically around SSH and RDP, in addition to a number of other protocols, but I wanted to call those out here because, of course, today's conversation is all about how do we defend SSH and RDP connections when we're not able to decrypt them. Well, the open source Zeek community has got your back. I've highlighted a couple GitHub pages here of some of the scripts that are freely shared in the open source community. There's a fingerprinting script specifically built for SSH connections and RDP connections. And on the SSH side, it's called the hash fingerprint. And what it does is it basically takes the client server kind of details and generates an alphanumeric hash. And so you can use that hash to start creating allow lists, which means suddenly you can say, well, I know that these are the approved hashes of known SSH connections in my environment. I want to know about everything that's not on this list. As soon as it's established, as soon as some new hash fingerprint comes into my environment, I want to know about that. Potentially interesting, potentially malicious, but I want that visibility up front. And hash fingerprinting gives you that capability set. On the RDP side, someone else in the community took a similar approach to fingerprint RDP connections with the RDFP fingerprinting script you see there. Now, notably on that script, that's for non-TLS encrypted RDP connections. But if you're dealing with a TLS encrypted RDP connection, you can use yet another script that the open source community has developed, the ever popular and infamous JA3 fingerprinting script, which, much like these other two scripts, creates an alphanumeric hash of client server connection details related to TLS SSL connections. And you can use those to start tracking your environment, inventorying your environment, and getting visibility into unknown. You can even get visibility into known bad, much like there are curated, threat intel feeds for IOCs. There's also curated intel feeds for JA3 fingerprints. So you can subscribe to those and actually start to alert and get visibility into known bad JA3 fingerprints popping up in your environment. So great example of kind of Zeek's kind of third and critical capability around its extensibility. The open source community has taken Zeek's extensibility and run with it and continues to run with it. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of scripts added in the last couple months that are just awesome. And these are great examples of that. Sorry, 1 second. Let me shut a window here. I forgot there's lawn mowing going on. The hazards of working from home. All right, window's closed. Hopefully that's a little better. All right, let's talk briefly now about Corelight. So where does Corelight fit into this picture? Corelight makes an open network detection and response platform. It's a commercial platform, and it's open for a couple reasons. It's open because it's comprised of open source technology under the hood. So our NDR platform is fundamentally Zeek based, but also supports Suricata, a very popular open source IDS technology that you're probably familiar with. It's open because we give our customers open access to the data sets and extensible capabilities of those platforms as well. Other vendors in the space sometimes use these tools under the hood, sometimes quietly and in a non-public manner, and typically lock them down and or put pretty significant training wheels on them and don't allow their customers to tinker with and extend the capabilities of those platforms, which, as we've seen, is, I think, one of the greatest powers of a tool like Zeek is its extensibility. Corelight doesn't do that. We want to empower our customers to use that underlying extensibility. So these platforms are fundamentally open. And open because we're committed to giving customers the experience and the workflows that they want in whatever environment that they want. We generate a wealth of detection, insight, and evidence capability in Corelight's NDR platform, again, based fundamentally around open source Zeek and Suricata, but we deliver these insights to a wide range of platforms because we don't want to lock our customers into a single pane of glass. We recognize that people like to switch SIMs, people like to have two SIMs for different use cases. People's needs change over time, and we want to be delivering the insight to the data lakes best suited for our customers. And so that's the last key element of openness in our platform is we're deeply committed to being a very flexible solution in terms of ingest and export of our insight and data. So how do we deliver this? We deliver it in a range of form factor sensors. We've got sensors for your cloud environments to monitor workloads in AWS, GCP, and Azure. Virtual format sensors that can run in VMware and Hyper-V environments. A software-based sensor that can run flexibly in containerized environments and Linux-based environments, as well as a fleet of appliance-based sensors for physical networks. We can support throughput speeds ranging from the low end at 2 gigabits per second with our AP200, all the way up to 100 gigabits per second plus of Zeek-based traffic analysis in our AP5000 sensor. That is an absolutely monstrous amount of capacity in a single 1U form factor sensor. Just to give you kind of a comparison, if you're not deeply familiar with open source Zeek deployments, typically in the open source world, the kind of leading deployments that we've heard about and seen are typically a cluster deployment, so a multi sensor rack that is, doing anywhere from 5 to upwards of 10 gigabits per second. And again, that's a cluster of sensors. Corelight, we built a single one-use sensor that can basically do a order of magnitude more processing capacity than that cluster. And so that's just one of many reasons that customers come to us from the open source side for our commercial offering is for the performance, reliability, and scalability of our commercial offerings. Now, of course, because it's Zeek based and because we are committed to delivering these data sets to our customers, that SSH log, that RDP log I showed you earlier, that's delivered as part of the Corelight platform, of course. Those scripts that I mentioned earlier, you can run those with your Corelight sensors. But we've gone beyond that. In our commercial offering, we don't just want to make this powerful technology easy to use, easy to manage, and super fast and performant. We want to extend the capabilities of these platforms with our own commercial, proprietary offering. And we've done that around RDP and SSH as just one example. And I wanted to call that out given the topic of today's conversation. So Corelight's encrypted traffic collection is a collection of Zeek packages. It curates lightly from the open source community. So we've included the best hits there on the left. You see the JA3 and hash fingerprinting package that I covered earlier. Those are open source community developed packages. And we, want to recognize great work where great work has been done and make it easy for our customers to directly install those open source packages from our platform. But the majority of this collection, north of 80 to 90% of this collection is proprietary insights that Corelight has developed using Zeek's scripting capabilities to really go deep around encrypted traffic, and specifically around RDP, SSH, and SSL traffic. And so those insights you see into potential risk on the right-hand side are just a sampling of some of the insights you get with Corelight. But you can see that we're talking about dozens and dozens of insights into SSH and RDP connections that can help you as a security analyst potentially find one of the aforementioned attacks that we've discussed at the beginning of this presentation around SSH and RDP. So for example, Corelight has an SSH client brute force detection capability built into our products. We're going to alert you when we see evidence of brute force detection activity. We're also going to give you insight around that authentication and let you know if it's successful. On the RDP side, right, same thing, brute force detection, authentication insights as well, password guessing insights as well, so we can highlight when someone appears to be trying to guess a password. A whole range of rich insights and detections around RDP and SSH traffic out of the box with every Corelight subscription on our sensors, no matter the form factor. So this is just one way that we've gone beyond kind of the open source capability set, which is, by itself quite a powerful tool and technology. And we really push the envelope there with our own proprietary insights and offerings that come with every Corelight sensor. So I promised I'd keep today's conversation on the shorter side, aiming for a half hour, and we're coming up pretty much right on that mark now. So just kind of quick summary here, and then let's go over to Q&A. RDP and SSH, remote friendly protocols that enable remote workers to do their jobs, but also friendly attack, not friendly, also, popular attack vectors because they're front doors to your organization, RDP and SSH, right? If you can break into those front doors, it's a very fast path to a very powerful seat inside your environment. And from those positions, from those seats, you can do a whole wide range of things. Because they're enabled for employees and because they're business enablement protocols, the converse side of that coin, of course, is that they're extremely powerful in adversarial hands. And we need to get ahead of that. We need to be thinking about how to defend against these protocols, especially in cases where decryption is not a possibility. You might be doing packet capture today in your environment, but if you don't have the keys to decrypt those packets, it doesn't matter if you're capturing, RDP and SSH packets. Those are kind of useless packets if you're not able to decrypt them. That's where Zeek and Corelight can really come in and help illuminate your environment around those RDP and SSH connections with those logs that I showed you earlier. Right? You can now see things like, hey, someone's using a Cyrillic keyboard layout in this RDP connection. That's very strange. I want to pull on that thread. I want to investigate. I want to pivot on that RDP log and go look at the other protocol activity associated with this connection. That exercise that I just described is quite simple and straightforward with Zeek or Corelight. It's a matter of pivoting in your SIM from that RDP log into the subsequent logs associated with that connection, all with that UID, just a single click illuminates all those associated protocols. But with Corelight, as I mentioned, we've built an additional capability set oriented around detection and enriched insight around RDP and SSH traffic. So dozens and dozens of proprietary detections and security enriched insights around these connections to help you as a defender understand what's going on, all without breaking and inspecting the connection. So it's saying, hey, this person made 5 login attempts here on this particular connection. They successfully authenticated. Here's the nature of connection, request and successful authentication. Here's the metadata detail associated with that. Here's a fingerprint for that, which, by the way, isn't on your whitelist. So this is an unknown connection coming into your environment and potentially needs to be dug into even deeper. Someone basically tried to potentially brute force their way in. That's the kind of thing you can find with Corelight's encrypted traffic collection. So if you're interested in learning more, please don't hesitate to reach out, info@corelight.com. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, mine's just John, John, @corelight.com. Happy to answer any questions there. And if you're interested in commercial solutions, please reach out, POCs, we can set you up, get you started in your own environment, in a lab environment, even in your home environment. We have an offering to help test out our capabilities as well. Or just visit us, www.corelight.com. A lot more information there about some of the topics we talked to today. Our blog in particular has a lot of great research posts by our research team who developed some of these insights that I talked about earlier. They've gone deep in some great technical blog posts on the topic of RDP and SSH security. So I'd encourage you, if for nothing else, to head over to the blog and do some reading if you're interested in these topics, because there's some really great technical research and insight as well delivered there on our blog. So with that, let's call it a wrap on the presentation. Let's head over to Q&A. Oh boy, awesome. Got a couple questions here. In addition to monitoring these protocols, do you have any best practice tips for securing RDP and SSH connection? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of basically hygiene things you can do in your environment from a inventory and lockdown perspective that can help make these attacks harder, right? And so that's things like removing root admin access, right? You can just disable that. You can set automated timeouts on connections. So if a connection's inactive, it can disable that connection. Strong passwords, obviously, obvious, but so important. There's a number of different kind of hardening techniques like that. And some simple Googling should pull up a great list. Corelight, our focus is really on the network security monitoring side, whereas those are kind of more hardening measures in your environment. So I think there's probably some other vendors out there that are more equipped to give you guidance there. But again, it's a both end proposition. You definitely want to be taking those hardening measures that I just mentioned, but you also want to be monitoring these protocols via an approach like Corelight offers as well. All right, here, let's see. Got another question here. In addition to RDP and SSH, are there other encrypted traffic protocols that Zeek can parse? Yes, so Zeek and Corelight, by extension, can parse not just RDP and SSH, but SSL traffic. So there's an SSL log that gets generated. Kerberos traffic, another encrypted protocol, is another example. There's an X509 log that gives you certificate detail for all the certs being used in your environment. So that's not a protocol per se, but it's a log that gets generated describing the certificate seen. There's a handful of others. So yeah, there's a good number of encrypted protocols that Zeek and Corelight can parse as well to give you insight into your environment. Let's see here. For remote workers, wouldn't you need the Security Onion client on your remote machines to get this data since they're not inside your sensor's network? Security Onion is a popular open source package that includes Zeek and includes Suricata. So it's a lot of open source tools bundled together just for reference and context for everyone's knowledge. And the question here is around basically points of visibility. Where do you deploy the Zeek kind of monitoring capability when you're dealing with a remote workforce? You certainly could get visibility from the remote machines and deploy it there, but it all depends on kind of your own network. So your mileage may vary hugely depending on how your network is configured. And I think it's a great example of where the slide I showed at the beginning around the SOC triad, right? The EDR plus NDR plus SIM, you need all of those things. And there are cases, depending on your network architecture and the nature of the connection, where the endpoint may be a stronger point of visibility to be monitoring that traffic, for sure. Let's see, copy of a slide deck. Yep, Carol has a copy of that, so I think that'll be made available to everybody attending today. Let's see, do you have any rules, IOCs, that are specific to cloud provider technologies? I'll answer that from Corelights perspective. So Corelights detection and alerting technology is twofold. One, it's the native detection technology and heuristics we've built into our product. So the encrypted traffic collection, as I mentioned, has a couple dozen Corelight proprietary detection insights. So yes, there's native detection technology. It's also a detection enablement capability that we offer in our product. So we support Suricata. We ourselves don't build or curate a Suricata rule set. We do allow customers to run flexibly whatever Suricata rule set that they want in the environment, whether that's open source, DIY, or commercial offering, and actually customers can directly license Proofpoint's ET Pro Suricata rule set from us if they like. So your question is, are there any rules or IOCs that are cloud provider technology specific? Not in our native detection technology that ships in our product. So I'll give you an example. Right, the RDP insights that we offer, some of our detection capabilities are built around known RDP clients that are used in exploit scenarios. So they're kind of popular RDP client infrastructure that attackers are often using as kind of their mechanism, and we're identifying that. So, that's not really environment specific, right? Those tools are broadly used across cloud, local, native, in physical environments as well. So yes, our detection capabilities will help you in a cloud environment, but I don't, to my knowledge, think any of them are specifically oriented around Azure or GCP traffic, for example. But on the second part of our platform capability, where we allow you to flexibly inject Intel rule sets, Suricata rules into our platform and alert on it, certainly there are many feeds out there, commercial, open source, or otherwise, that have specific rule sets built around cloud environments. You could run those on your Corelight sensors and start generating alerts. Let's see here. Can you talk more about best practices of deployments for sensors? Sure. So why don't we start with the cloud environment, since we were just talking about that. So in the cloud environment, basically, the way it works is one of two ways. Either one, you're using a native traffic mirroring capability offered by the cloud vendor to send mirrored traffic to your Corelight sensor in that environment, or you're probably using an agent-based technology to do that mirroring function in the cloud. So Nubeva is a good example of one of those technologies. They have native cloud traffic mirroring capabilities in their platform. So Corelight is fundamentally linked to one of those two technologies to be able to get and ingest the packets before we can run our processes and generate logs and insights around that traffic. So in a cloud environment, for example, in Amazon's world, it's connecting to the AWS VPC traffic mirror, and our cloud sensor is deployed as an Amazon machine image. You would deploy that in your AWS environment, configure and connect it to the VPC traffic mirror, and you'd be off and running, and point it, of course, to a SIEM or data lake environment, and then you'd be off and running. So that's a cloud deployment example. Physical networks obviously look very different. There are perimeter deployments of our technology. Again, it's not inline. It's not an active blocking technology. Neither Zeek nor Corelight is inline active blocking. It's passive out-of-band monitoring and insight and detection capability set. So it's not inline right behind the firewall. It's out-of-band hanging off of typically a packet broker in a physical network. Something like Ixia, for example, right, can mirror traffic in their packet broker offering. Or hanging off an optical tap or a span port as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be a packet broker, although for large throughput environments, complex network environments, we typically recommend going with packet brokers, given the kind of traffic mirroring reliability and filtering capabilities that they offer. So that's kind of the physical network side. But we also have customers that deploy east-west internally as well, where they're monitoring internal traffic that doesn't kind of talk out to public internet infrastructure. So, database deployments are common, where they're basically, again, hooking off of a packet broker, monitoring, sensitive internal development environments, for example. So, I gave you a bunch of answers. You asked for best practices. It just depends on the environment, and whatever your environment is, whatever your configuration is, our aim is to basically have a sensor format ready to go for you to be able to monitor those traffic workloads. Let's see here. All right. I promised I'd keep it short, and we're now at 45 minutes. So I feel if I go any longer, I would really break that promise. Tried to keep it under an hour today. So let's see. Let's go to one more question here. Just looking through a few here, and I'll try to follow up with people afterwards whose questions we don't get to. Okay. I like this question. Can you talk more about how the JA3 script plays into this problem space? Yes. So I mentioned that the RDP fingerprint, the open source script that I referenced earlier, that helps fingerprint RDP connections, notably is for non-TLS encrypted RDP connections. So if you're dealing with a TLS encrypted RDP connection, that script is not going to be helpful in that context. So you're going to want to look to JA3, which is a popular open source TLS SSL fingerprinting script developed by a couple of folks who were originally all over at Salesforce in the security engineering side. And it's a really great and widely used script, and it can fingerprint. It doesn't care that it's an RDP connection. It can fingerprint the nature of that TLS connection, irrespective of that protocol. So it's going to be generating that fingerprint for that encrypted RDP connection. So you will get again an alphanumeric hash that is tied to that particular RDP connection through the JA3 script. Another point I'll just add, because we're talking about this at the moment, is people often ask about TLS 1.3. Like, does that, hey, doesn't that remove visibility? Would that break the JA3 script? Yes, TLS 1.3 as a standard does remove some of the inspectable elements of the kind of handshake establishing an encrypted connection, certainly, but it doesn't fundamentally break the JA3 script, and the folks that created it actually wrote some documentation. I believe it's on the GitHub itself, describing how JA3 is persistent even in the face of 1.3 TLS 1.3 encrypted traffic. So if you have questions about JA3, honestly, I think the best resource is just to go to that GitHub. Again, slides will be made available. There's a direct link there, and go read the documentation that these developers put together. It's really deep and fantastic. I think it should answer most of your questions about that, but hopefully I answered at least the high level question there about how it relates to these protocols that we discussed. So with that, yeah, I'm gonna call it a wrap. Give everybody 10 plus minutes back in their day. Thank you so much for joining. I'm gonna try to follow up with some other people who asked questions we weren't able to get to via email. Carol, any kind of closing comments? But I think that's it for me.
All right, great. Yes, I'll make sure to get those questions over to you, John, so you can address them when you have time. All right, well, thanks so much for your great presentation, and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.